Welcome to Inspiration Inc. I have a very special guest with me today who virtually single-handedly transformed the auto industry in India forever and who also gave India its first people's car. I have with me the big boss of Maruti, Mr. R.C. Bhargava. Sir, thank you so much for joining us on ET Now, and it's a pleasure having you on this show. In this show, we will talk about the unexplored part of your life and unexplored part of your journey. But before that, I want to start with a very simple question. You know, when you decided to join Maruti, you were already having a very bright career ahead of you, being an IAS officer,
Sure.
and you would have become cabinet secretary soon. What made you take up this challenge of getting into something like Maruti? And I remember you joined Maruti only for a year, but then it just went on and it still continues.
No, when I joined Maruti in 1981, it was on deputation from the IAS.
Correct.
After a year, I was asked to exercise my option of either going back or staying on.
Right.
And at that time, I consulted lots of people and thought about it myself. Most of the advice was to go back because nobody saw a future in Maruti.
Right.
But my problem was that way back in 82, 83, there were no options for people who retired from the service, even if you became cabinet secretary, in terms of any useful employment.
Correct.
The only employment really which was available was as a liaison officer for some of the big houses.
Correct.
And I came to the conclusion that I was not temperamentally suitable
To do something
to do
like
that kind of a job. So I said, what will I do? With the salaries which we had in those days, there was just no money to even live when one was working.
Correct.
And my wife had to work so that we could put our children through school. So I said, what happens when I retire? I don't have land, I don't have a house, I have nothing in the bank. The pension will be a pittance. So what happens? One didn't know that things would change so much afterwards. So I took the risk. I said, let me work here. Some experience I'll gain of working in business and industry. And maybe that will help me get some employment when I retire, because at that time I had 10 years to retire.
If we speak about early days at Maruti, now actually what you and the team was trying to do at Maruti was to create a new ecosystem in India which did not exist.
Sure.
And also to an extent that not even a single part of Maruti at that point, the component, was locally available in India.
Absolutely.
So that's a humongous task, you know, setting up a factory, creating the entire supply chain, and then actually going ahead and producing a car which changed India's auto industry forever. And since then, the Indian auto industry has not really looked back. So, I mean, how was that experience?
You see, sometimes it's easier to start something new and on a clean slate than trying to rebuild from the old system. Because the old system is not necessarily appropriate, let's put it that way. And we had the complete support of the Japanese Suzuki, who knew exactly how to build a car.
Correct.
So there was a lot of, let's say, backstopping available to us. What we had to do, of course, was to look after the local end of things and to make the kind of policies which we felt would work in the Indian environment, but which to a large extent borrowed from the concepts of what the Japanese did to build their own industry. You know, Japan is a country which has no natural resources,
Correct.
no sources of energy. They have to export about half their production to pay for what they produce.
Correct.
And yet they became the most competitive manufacturing country in the world. Here we have a state which is 200 kilometers away from the main centers, and we need all kinds of special schemes to support industrialization in that scheme. And it doesn't happen. So I think the approach of the Japanese is quite different. And we did understand what happened in Japan. And we said we'll bring the same concepts to India, but naturally not in a way in which the Japanese did, but with modifications so that it can work in India. Motivation was that Mr. Krishnamurti had been in the public sector.
Right.
I had spent 2 years in a public sector before I came to Maruti. And we knew what the public sector was doing even at that time. We were convinced that if we followed what was being done in the public sector, the results would not be much different. And since this was going to be my last job, and Mr. Krishnamurti had a whole career of successful working, to the extent public sector working is successful, he also wanted to do something which would leave a good legacy behind for him.
Right.
So we both decided that the answer is to do things differently. And that's where that Japanese concepts and translating that into the Indian scheme of things came along.
So what was the initial feeling and reaction when the first car rolled out, and it was received with a thumping response? And obviously, I mean, I remember in those days, the Maruti 800 itself used to be a luxury, a style statement, and in a way it personified the new India or the emerging India.
Sure.
You know, so person used to drive it with a lot of pride. So, I mean, how was that initial feeling?
I think at that time we were all totally on a huge high that we've done it, we've met the target of getting a car out before the end of '83, because that is what had been told to us that we had to do. But that this car was going to meet with a big response was known earlier, because when we did our marketing circuit around India to tell people that this is the car we're going to produce and all that, it was clear that there's going to be an overwhelming response. That's why, if you remember, we brought in that system of advance booking.
Correct.
And then a computerized way of allocation. And that time we had got orders for the 800, which stretched for about 5 years of production. So that was not an issue. But the thrill of getting a car out, of having Mrs. Gandhi release it, and of seeing the excitement amongst all our employees that we have done it, that was a big...
I think Maruti was a huge experiment on the part of the government also, and I think it was the biggest example then of something which we are struggling with even today, that is Make in India. Do you think somewhere that we lost the track later on, and we could not sustain the success and the pace with which Maruti was created and the cars were rolled out? It could have been replicated in other sectors also, from manufacturing perspective.
Mihir, we have it's not a question of losing the track, because we were never on track. If you go back to 1950 and look at all the industries we set up, literally tens and tens of thousands of crores were invested in the public sector. Public sector, okay, is one side. The private sector, of course, had limited scope for growth because of the licensing policy.
Right.
But neither the public sector nor the private sector ever really got going to becoming a competitive industry in terms of its ability to produce products which could compare with what was available in the rest of the world, which could perhaps be sold outside India. The crisis of 1991 was because we had nothing to sell. There was no foreign exchange left.
Right.
So we were never on track on this. Yes, Maruti, because we adopted the Japanese concepts, I believe, we came on track. And we ran the company differently from both the public sector and the private sector. Till today, I don't think, barring some of our vendors or one or two other companies, anybody has tried to replicate the management systems and bringing in the same idea of Japanese concepts into in India. Now, why that is not being done is another issue.
Right.
So I don't think this is the time to go into it. But the fact is we are not doing it, and that is why we are struggling to increase our industrial output. We are not competitive as a manufacturing country.
I understand that there was a huge pipeline of orders for Maruti 800, and I mean everything said and there was a lot of excitement. But did you, in those days, visualize or expect this kind of success for the company also? See, having one or two right products is a different thing.
Yeah. You know, at that time, we were all so much concerned with just meeting what we were supposed to do. Increasing production from 20,000 in the first year up to 100,000, because that was the company goal.
Correct.
In getting localization targets met, because there was a phased manufacturing program, and we had to localize according to that phased manufacturing program. To get over all the difficulties which were being encountered in terms of ships not getting berthing, transport not happening, some other issue coming along, licenses not being given, some inspector raising some problems. There was no thinking at all of what the future would be. The future at the first few years was limited to getting the first 5 years done and getting to 100,000 cars a year, setting up a dealer network, getting the vendors working, vendor quality, getting vendor supplies in time to keep the production line running. We were swamped with problems. And in that kind of an environment, you don't think that, oh, what will happen in 2005? No way.
Correct. Well, you did have your ups and downs with the employees also, with the government also. How did you deal with it? Because, you know, right from being the leader and leading the company the way you did, from there getting into that tiff with the government, and you know, I know there were issues and government even had an objection of you continuing with Maruti. How did you deal with that personally?
No, the government's problem was not about my continuing. It was about who would be my successor. I was to retire anyway as managing director in '97.
Correct.
But the whole dispute between Suzuki and government was who would be my successor.
Correct.
Fortunately, that dispute got sorted out before too much damage could be done. And I think you have to thank primarily the government which came into power, I think when was it, 99 or something like that, and Mr. Sikandar Bhatt. Sikandar Bhatt, as Minister of Industry, very quickly realized that this dispute would harm India and harm Indian industry. And he found a solution.
I mean, you know, so being part of a company which was right at the center of, at that point, such a large controversy.
That was not a very, what should I say, happy period for anybody. And Suzuki had actually gone for international arbitration.
Right.
And I was not involved in the discussions in those times because partly I was out of India for several months that time. I was having some treatment done outside. But otherwise also, you know, having retired, it was best I kept out of this. So this settlement of Suzuki with the government, when it happened, I was not involved in that at all. The other problem we faced was, of course, in 2012.
Correct.
When the Manesar problem happened.
Right, the unrest.
The unrest.
Yeah.
And that problem was not in the original Gurgaon plant. It was in a new plant which had been set up. And I think what happened in that plant was a number of mistakes from both sides. But essentially it was a breakdown of proper understanding of the people who were employees, who should have been employees, who should have been recruited, how they should have been recruited, how they should have been trained, how communication should have happened, and their reactions also were similar. So there was mistakes there. But what happened was something quite different. It was not because of the workers, just feeling that, but something which still today is hard to explain. Why workers should attack all management employees en masse? It doesn't make sense for anybody.
True.
Nobody can explain till today how that could possibly have succeeded in getting any benefit either to the union or the worker or any political party or anybody.
Right.
It was a lose-lose for everybody, but it happened.
It happened. Now, since you have been, observing the auto industry for so long, Maruti was originally known to come out with people's car. I mean, Indians relate with it, and I mean, I remember that tagline that India comes home in a Maruti.
Yeah.
So, so do you think a project like Nano ideally should have been not necessarily Nano or not necessarily 100,000 rupees car, but an attempt of that sort should have happened in Maruti? Or, I mean, what is your view as an industry veteran on that?
See, the Maruti 800 was the smallest, lowest cost car which we could produce. Suzuki has always prided itself on its ability to design and manufacture cars which have the least cost and which give the best value to customers. Suzuki sells in Japan on the basis of value for money.
True.
Suzuki was very clear that you could not lower the costs below what the Maruti 800 was and still give to customers the kind of product that they would want to have, which would be reliable, safe, and would meet all their expectations.
Standards, yeah.
When the Nano was announced and what Mr. Ratan Tata said, it was a laudable attempt. But I think that product, Suzuki looked at it, we looked at it, and we came to the conclusion that we cannot make a car at 1 lakh of rupees.
Today, do you think the Indian auto industry is actually at an inflection point, because we are hearing so much about electric vehicles and the way fuel consumption pattern is going to be, the way auto manufacturers, including Maruti, are trying to reorient the future products pipeline. I mean, when you do crystal ball gazing, what can you sense?
That the fuel to be used in cars for transportation, mobility, has to undergo a change is, I think, without question. You cannot continue this total reliance on petroleum. Its cost is too high. I don't think we can afford to keep importing larger and larger quantities of oil.
True.
The strategic risks are high because the oil comes only from a limited few companies. And we have seen what happens when somebody puts a sanction on some country and all that kind of thing.
Right.
So it's necessary to change the fuel if you have to import, to diversify the sources of import. That's absolutely clear. How to do it is the challenge. Electric vehicles is obviously one of the things which the whole world is looking at. On a long-term basis, it's still not very clear that electric vehicles is necessarily the long-term answer to this problem.
Okay.
There is an option of fuel cells and hydrogen. Japan is working on that in a big way. China has gone in for hydrogen cars. Other countries are working at it. So one of the things which I think we need to do as a country, looking at our resource endowment and our problems and our strategic risks, is whether we should, on a long-term basis, go for electric cars or for fuel cells and hydrogen as a fuel. The infrastructure requirement for both is very large.
Correct.
Probably for hydrogen it's a much larger infrastructure. But we cannot afford, in my judgment, to put in first infrastructure for one and then
For the other.
It's better to make a choice now and go for that on a bigger way. The question still comes that while we take this decision, which may take 2 years, 3 years to work out all the information and the analysis to take a really sound data-based decision, what happens to the country's fuel? And there, I think we have options available in India. For example, CNG is an option. The production of CNG in India is much larger than the production of crude in India.
Correct.
So a larger number of vehicles can be fueled by our own domestic fuel. Number two, CNG is available from a number of other countries. And in some of them, at least, the strategic risk is very different from what it is from crude oil. That's the second option. The cost of CNG is lower than the cost of crude oil, petrol or diesel. So for all these reasons, and there is no infrastructure required except to have the dispensing outlets, which does require some investment in pipelines and things, and which has to be made, but to some extent that has to be done even if you want to do expansion of petrol and diesel.
Correct.
So to some extent, but it's a much lower investment which will be required than what will be required for electric vehicles.
Correct. I'll ask you a couple of personal questions. So one is, what is your biggest inspiration? Because, you know, if we look at your journey, you excelled in studies, you excelled in IAS, you excelled in Maruti. What is your driving force? What inspires you? Or the most inspirational person in your life?
Partly this business of excelling in studies and excelling in this and that is to a large extent genetic. I don't think I can say that I have something special which I have done.
Right.
I don't think that's ever true. Partly it's genetic, partly it's education and the value systems which were instilled in you as a child growing up. Largely luck, I would say.
Right. One last question. India is obviously the youngest country, and there are a lot of youngsters or youth who might be watching this show. What would be your message to them?
I think the main thing which is what I've been talking about, that the values of what makes a good human being. And to me, discipline is a very, very important value to have. We were taught never to waste. That's another value in school. You took food on your plate. You were not allowed to leave anything on it. You could not.
I think that's a very meaningful advice. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us and giving us your time.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you, sir.